Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kevin Igoe, Managing Director of PFP. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dawn Register and Jack Sloggett of BDO, and we're going to cover today a topic that's very hot in the world of taxation at the moment, with the advent of COS and the inquiries and nudge letters that have now been emerging. And it's one of the things that we're encouraging firms to really get to understand the regime and exactly how it works, because the consequences of not getting it right could be quite severe financially and potentially worse than that for clients and indeed accountants. So if I start by welcoming Dawn and Jack, perhaps you'd like to just say hello to our listeners.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And we at BDO have a team that specialise in tax disputes. So I wanted to share with you some of the letters that we're seeing from HMRC and some of the practical tips that come across our desk. My experience is private client tax and then specialising in tax disputes.
Hello, it's Jack Sloggett here, and I work in Dawn's team in the tax dispute resolution team at BDO. So again, my primary focus is private client, but over the last few years we started seeing a bit more corporate work as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, both Dawn and Jack have said they're happy to take questions throughout. The more difficult, the better. So it makes them feel better for coming out all the way to the giddy heights of London. So please feel free to ask questions in the usual way. So without any further ado, if we can just crack on.
So we wanted to give you some context first, and I think it's context in terms of what's happening in the world and also what feeds HM Revenue and Customs and the letters that come through onto our desks. So we do now have the Common Reporting Standard, as Kevin mentioned, and this means that the world is more connected than ever it has been. In particular, the tax authorities are sharing information automatically. In years gone by, if you spoke to a tax inspector and he wanted to find out something from a foreign authority, he would often have to write a letter and wait 6 months or 12 months to get some information back, by which time the inquiry will have finished or the person will have disappeared. So whereas now we know HMRC is receiving from September last year information from over 100 countries on people who have some kind of connection to the UK. So usually they're either a British passport holder, they have a UK address, or they file a UK tax return, or have identified in some way that they're a UK individual. HMRC has said it's already received over 22 billion lines of data that is going through its bank accounts at the moment. And very interesting, because a lot of us sitting here may think, well, actually, I don't deal with many people who have offshore accounts or offshore interests. But I think the revenue themselves have been quite staggered by the number of people who do. So the data has shown them that 1 in 10 people in the UK, so 10% of people, have some offshore connection. So whether that's a bank account, a holiday home, an asset, an insurance policy, something that connects them financially to a country outside of the UK. And that has been quite staggering. So what's the result of that in practical terms? Well, it means that we have our title for you today, which is that the revenue are obsessed with anything offshore and are likely to continue to be, I think, in the near future. They think that it does lead to tax loss, and therefore it should generate inquiry activity. Of course, there's nothing wrong with having a bank account offshore. It doesn't matter if your bank account's on the local high street or in a tax haven. The question is whether or not you report it correctly on your tax return. And so what is the activity that the revenue are doing in practice? Well, we have the Worldwide Disclosure Facility, which has been running for some time. Up until last September, 18,000 people had already registered for the Worldwide Disclosure Facility. So if you wanted to be devil's advocate, you could say, well, actually, the revenue's obsession with offshore is quite accurate. If there's that many people who feel they need to come forward voluntarily. Alongside this, the revenue are looking at residence and non-domicile status, and Jack will mention this a bit later on. Of course, many of you will be aware that we had a legal requirement called the requirement to correct that ended 30th of September 2018, which created a window of opportunity for people who did have an offshore tax problem, whether that was deliberate or by accident, to come forward and correct it with the promise of lower penalties. And of course, now we're in the world of much higher penalties. And again, Jack's going to talk you through those failure to correct penalties later on.
Okay, so we have a few questions just come in, early ones from Will. Is it just bank accounts information?
Yes.
And
so
is it just interest or balances as well?
So it is balances as well. It actually is more than bank account information. So you'll find if people have investments overseas, this has also triggered CRS reporting. So, I mean, in practice, for example, I've seen someone with an overseas pension fund, someone with an overseas life insurance bond, that has triggered the CRS data. So it's not just cash in a bank account.
So Adam says, is the information coming through the foreign tax authorities or direct from banks to the UK?
The way the process works is it's foreign bank to the foreign tax authority, and then it's all transmitted to HMRC as a bulk data.
Okay. What countries, are they naming the countries in the letters?
They're not. However, in practice, I can tell you that I've had two experiences now where I've phoned HMRC, and Jack will show you the nudge letter later on, in response to a nudge letter, because my client just didn't know what they were referring to, and they actually did tell us the country. So that was very helpful, actually. So when I asked them, look, could you give us a clue? Because this client actually had a part of her pension fund in Guernsey, and she didn't realise.
So was it just the country they told you, or was there any other facts about the issue?
It was actually just the country. So I think you can find out the country if you phone the helpline.
Yeah, we've certainly had people phone and be told the country.
Yeah.
If we made a disclosure in September 18, will HMRC confirm the case has been dealt with and closed?
Oh, is this just probably a delay?
Yeah.
So we've had some more than 6 months. They should, I mean, if it's been more than 6 months, you should chase them up. There's no fixed deadline for HMRC to reply, but their guidance says they should look at it within 6 months.
Okay, so just 2 or 3 more before we move on. How long will the LWDF last, do you think?
At the moment, there's no fixed end date. I think they're likely to keep it open. I mean, if you kind of believe our heading that there is an obsession with offshore and it does raise tax revenue, I think they'll keep it open ended.
Have you been aware of anybody prosecuted either for not making a complete disclosure under WDF or simply as a result of the CRS data being supplied?
Not yet is the answer, but my understanding is certainly prosecutions are in, or certainly reviews of cases with a view to prosecution are in progress. I mean, it is clear from the revenue policy, so I put no safe havens up there, that they do want to pursue some people through the criminal route.
Yeah. Okay. What about a bit buying a property abroad? Does that trigger HMRC's attention?
Yeah, I mean, usually that does lead to somebody having a bank account. I mean, that's the kind of classic, isn't it? Your holiday home, rental property abroad, whereby you may not actually have any tax problem because you've just got a bank account to pay the electricity bill and the local property charges. Yeah.
Certainly, we've seen some from particularly Ireland. I've seen a couple of letters saying we understand you got property.
Yeah.
So they've obviously got something, stamp duty or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
back on.
So let's just move on. In terms of what HMRC are actually doing with the data, I mean, this is quite interesting, and I think having had a look at Connect, which is their computer system, it's probably more sophisticated than most people realise. I mean, I think most people have a kind of negative impression of the government and technology, but HMRC are really using technology to analyse this data very closely, also cross-referencing it to tax returns, possibly even other government data, so things like border agency for a residence case we've seen. And how are they going to deal with the discrepancies? So the nudge letter will talk about, yes, we are seeing regular tax return inquiries. Are they looking to charge failure to correct penalties? They are. And some Code of Practice 9 serious investigations. And we've obviously already had the question about potential prosecutions. Just before we get into the nudge letter, I wanted to show people kind of hot off the press, if people can see it, hopefully they can enlarge it on their screens. This is a very recent letter just supporting the obsession with offshore, written to a tenant in a property that is owned by an overseas company. So, and there's no statutory basis for this, so a bit like the nudge letters, is just asking for information about how much they're paying, probably looking to see whether the company has declared non-resident landlord tax, or whether there's a more fundamental problem with the tax issues of the company. But quite interesting that they're actually following up on the data, and there's been a lot of media coverage about number of properties owned by overseas companies.
So was this letter sent to someone who resident overseas?
No, it was actually just someone who's a tenant,
as
a tenant in the UK property. So it's not even relating to their own tax affairs.
Link's quite tenuous, isn't it, in some cases?
Yeah. I mean, they may not be under inquiry, they may not even file tax returns, but they've got a letter from the revenue.
So we will be sending around copies of the slides after the presentation. So if those of you can't read it, you'll be able to read it then.
Yeah. Okay. So just moving on to, I guess, the now infamous nudge letter. Some of you will be familiar with this. For those of you who aren't, they're all headed up the same. I mean, this is the February version, but they've come out in batches every month since January this year. So I
think someone said that the batches on every month of this year, there's been batches. This has been based on data received from CRS countries, but before that there were different batches. I think there's been 3 batches of nudge letters. So the first batch was released in March 17, and that was in relation to the US tax authorities collecting data for FACTA, which is sort of the US equivalent of CRS. The second batch came out in February 2018, and that was in relation to HMRC receiving information from the Crown dependencies, so Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey. So up on screen, we've got an example of the nudge letter. Effectively, what it's saying is HMRC saying to an individual, we have information that you've got income or gains overseas, and that there may be a UK tax liability. Like Dawn said earlier, it doesn't give much away. So it doesn't give away the country, it doesn't give away the asset abroad, and it doesn't matter how much tax may be at stake. So we could, back to the example earlier, we could look at, this could be sent to an individual who's got an overseas property and they've got a bank account, or that's got €5 of interest a year arising, or it could be sent to some tycoon who's got a bank account here, there and everywhere. It doesn't matter, HMRC will send the same letter. So what's the purpose of these? I mean, effectively, so we'll go back actually, sorry. Purpose of these is HMRC putting the onus on the taxpayer to come forward with everything they have. I mean, if you want to see what effectively a phishing exercise, it's them trying to get as much information. Now, alongside these nudge letters, HMRC are also attaching a certificate of tax position, which is coming up on the next slide. So I hope you can see this. What I'm focusing on here is the right-hand side of the page. Now, on the bottom half of the page, it says, it gives you 2 options. What HMRC wants is for taxpayers to sign this certificate of tax position, confirming one of the 2 options. So the first one is, I need to bring my tax affairs up to date. I will declare all my UK tax irregularities using HMRC's worldwide disclosure facility. The problem with this is that if a taxpayer signs this, HMRC are going to know there's some tax issue, and it forces the taxpayer to make a disclosure pretty much straight away. And if you don't make a disclosure straight away, HMRC may take action. Now, the second option that HMRC wants taxpayers to sign in on says, my tax affairs do not need updating. I do not have any additional tax to pay. I've declared all my offshore income, assets and gains which are taxable in the UK. Now, the problem here is that these certificate of tax positions, there's no de minimis value. So if a taxpayer comes forward and wants to sign the second option, but they've got nothing else to declare, and they forget about some long lost bank account that's accruing €5 of interest a year, and they sign this, if you look at the top of the page, it says, choosing to make a full statement or complete a full certificate is a criminal offence that can result in interrogation and prosecution. So before a taxpayer signs this, they have to be completely sure that there's no sort of outstanding income and gain that's UK tax is due on. And the final point on these letters is that it's not like a self-assessment tax return where you're just covering 1 year. These certificates want you to cover multiple years. We've got a question.
Yeah, a client has a pension in offshore and tax is paid on the pension received in the offshore country. The pension receipt is not remitted to the UK. Should this be declared in the UK? Well, depend on his domicile.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends. If someone's taxable on a worldwide basis, then they should declare everything in the UK, and then it's a case of looking at any double taxation agreements. So, and these are the kind of questions that, of course, the CRS data is triggering. Is it might be that tax has been paid fully overseas. We've seen a lot of that on foreign dividends, foreign pensions, foreign investments. But actually, if it needs to be declared in the UK as well, then that is a compliance issue that may need to be corrected. Yeah.
Somebody's commented the nudge letters are drafted in conjunction with HMRC's behavioural change department. They're carefully worded to encourage taxpayer action.
Well, and of course, Jack's just highlighted the very stark criminal warning, and of course, that is designed to provoke a response. Yeah,
I think the main point is that HMRC are setting the bar very high for taxpayers. They're asking them to do something that in some cases might be very difficult for them to do. So go to the next slide. How should advisors and taxpayers deal with these nudge letters? I think the number one tip, and we should always do, is respond to them. I would say don't leave it more than 30 days to respond, even if that's a holding response, just to acknowledge that you received the letter and that you're obtaining information to answer in full. I think responding, it puts the ball in your court. You can explain why there's income and gain offshore. You can, if it's a particularly complex case, you can preempt any further questions HMRC may have, and that can avoid protracted, long drawn out correspondence with HMRC, which nobody wants. The second thing is to check if there's an open inquiry. The nudge letter may have a direct link to the open inquiry, and if that's the case, give HMRC a call, give the inspector who's dealing with the inquiry a call and ask them if it is related. Get as much information as possible about this nudge letter. As Dawn said, I've got some clients who have no idea what was going on, and it's only after a phone call to HMRC they found out the country it related to. So then also, I think considering your disclosure options, the certificate of tax position, it very clearly states that the taxpayer should make a disclosure under the WDF, but in some cases, WDF may not be the best choice to make a disclosure. I mean, WDF is very helpful. It's online. It's quite simple to fill out, but let's remember that actually WDF does not provide protection against prosecution. If there's a serious if there's deliberate tax frauds, then it may be worth considering using the Code of Practice 9, which does offer protection from prosecution. That is only if a full disclosure is made and nothing is sort of left out. Another option is Code of Practice 8. This is typically used for avoidance cases, but unlike the WDF, it allows taxpayers to make a full written disclosure. I think if you've seen the WDF online form, there's a little box that says, please explain any wrongdoing, and it's about 100 characters long. So you may as well tweet HMRC rather than doing that. So it's worth considering, rather than going straight in WDF, register WDF, consider what the issue is and whether doing a COP 8 or COP 9 is more appropriate.
And you mentioned avoidance there. I mean, it's interesting because all the controversy around the loan charge, Kevin, that avoidance is caught by all of this, of course. If anything is offshore, even if it's just part of a payment structure to get the loans, those people unfortunately may end up in the CRS data with a nudge letter as well. So yeah.
So coming back to the certificate of tax position, you said here on the slide, consider whether to sign and return. Now, we understand that CIOT and HMRC had discussions regarding this certificate, and there's actually no legal basis for a taxpayer to return it. Instead, HMRC have said that they will accept a response in writing explaining what has gone on. So it goes back to my point where the number one thing to do with nudge letters is respond. Like I said, I don't think it's the best idea to sign a certificate of tax position just because there's potential for you to get prosecuted by HMRC. So I think instead, write a letter, respond to HMRC, set out the facts and explain the position.
Do be careful if there's an open inquiry as well, as Jack highlighted, because the danger is you make the disclosure on the offshore matter and then the inquiry carries on as well. So you're then dealing with two strands of HMRC at the same time. We've certainly got a couple of cases like that where we've now got a disclosure to resolve and an inquiry still open.
So I have a question. If you want to initiate either a COP 8 or COP 9 rather than WDF, how do you go about that? Who do you write to? Who do you contact?
Well, Code 9 is the most straightforward because there's actually a specific form to apply for Code of Practice 9 called CDF1. So if you type either of those processes into the Revenue website, you can get the HMRC booklet that sets out both processes. Code of Practice 8 is actually only issued by HMRC, so you would have to ask for their agreement that it can be dealt with under Code of Practice 8.
So you mentioned this, there's an open inquiry, but can that prevent the WDF disclosure being made?
No, that's fine.
Plenty of them.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, ideally, you ask for the inquiry. If it's related to offshore matters, you actually ask for the inquiry to then be resolved through the WDF process.
We had one when we phoned up the inspector, and she was more than happy for us to go down the WDF route, just because it meant she could get it all in one sort of package rather than having to write back and forwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the last point on the dealing with nudge letters, I would recommend reading the CIOT guidance. There's a link there at the bottom. It's very clear, very concise of what they recommend to do if a nudge letter received by one of your clients. So, common issues. So, there's a multitude of issues that HMRC can pick up on and send a nudge letter in relation to. So, it's the usual stuff, so bank accounts overseas, assets overseas, properties overseas that are being let, the resident status of an individual. Have they come over to the UK quite a lot, and have the number of days pushed them into UK resident status? The domicile status of an individual, especially with the deemed domicile rules that have come in. A lot of people's domiciles now technically deemed UK domicile because they've been here for the last 15 years. So it's always worth considering that option. Some of the more sort of niche areas and issues, so like Dawn said earlier, there's pensions, pension fund who've got assets within the UK and overseas. You've got offshore trustees. Again, they might have a large portfolio with UK source income in it, and that's why HMRC will target them. Another thing is remittances to the UK. Individuals might not think that money has been remitted to the UK, but it may be that a bank has cleared it through a UK bank, or they hold an investment that they didn't realise was a UK investment. So a lot of the time it may not be clear initially what the issue is, but HMRC aren't going to send a letter if there's no smoke. And so I think it's worth exploring all the avenues available to you.
And I think the other thing the revenue were quite surprised about is the fact that a lot of offshore trustees did register for the WDF prior to the 30th of September deadline last year. So whether there was something seriously wrong, or it was just things, as Jack highlighted, like the accidental remittances, or they didn't realise actually they did hold a few UK shares, but there was a big surge of registrations in the run up to the 30th of September.
Did they ever issue any stats on how many people registered but ultimately didn't need to?
No, I haven't. I don't know how many fell by the wayside. It'd be interesting to find out, actually. Yeah.
But as you can see, there's a lot of issues that HMRC could pick up on, and now they've got all this information. The question is for HMRC in particular is how do they go through all this information and get the tax back they feel that is due to them. So if you go to the next slide. So what HMRC have introduced is they extended the offshore assessment time limits. So the current time limits for errors and tax returns there's 3 of them. We've got where a reasonable excuse happens, the client's got a reasonable excuse, HMRC can go back 4 years and assess 4 years tax prior to the current year. There's a careless behaviour, and HMRC can go back 6 years, and a deliberate behaviour, and HMRC can go back 20 years. Now, this new extended assessment time limit regarding offshore, it only affects reasonable excuse and careless behaviour. So the deliberate 20-year assessment time period remains the same. So what's happened here is they have lumped careless behaviour and reasonable excuse together. So what happens now is for offshore matters, HMRC have got 12 years to go back and assess. I think the first thing that comes to mind is taxpayers may think that this is quite unfair, especially if there's a reasonable excuse. I mean, they'll be of the mind that they've done nothing wrong, it wasn't their fault. And now HMRC is saying, well, actually, we can go back 12 years and assess tax on that, which is something that actually isn't their fault. But like I said, it's HMRC wanting to have the time to go trawl through all this additional new information they received.
Yeah.
Another thing, actually, that's a sort of administrative thing that is an issue is that who keeps records for 12 years? Banks only keep it for 6-7 years, and it may be actually that we have to advise clients that if they've got any offshore matters, they have to keep records for a whole 12 years, and it's where they keep them. It's a lot of time and effort to do that.
Yeah, and we did actually flag to HMRC during the consultation period that this contradicts their own guidance on record keeping. Most accountants who write out with their tax return covering letters suggest keeping records for 6 years. So if you could get a discovery assessment in 10 years' time, this is obviously extremely worrying in terms of how you're going to defend it, and will you have the evidence to appeal and defend it. I mean, needless to say, this is actually horribly complicated, the time limits now, in terms of working out what behaviour applies, the extended 12 years, plus the requirement to correct extended deadlines as well. So it really isn't straightforward.
So I think the thing to point out for this extended time limits is that 2019-20 is the first year that it will apply. So what that means is a knock-on effect on past years. So if you look at reasonable excuse, so 2019-20, before these time limits came in, the earliest year that HMRC could look at for reasonable excuse is 4 years before this, so that's 2015-16. Now these new rules are effectively frozen 2015-16, so it means that HMRC have got until 2027-28, so that's 4 years going back to 15-16, plus another 8 years to take you to 2027-28. And the same principle applies for careless. So careless error in this year, 2019-20, typically you'd have to go back to 2013-14, but that year now again is frozen. So HMRC have got until 2025-26 to assess on 2013-14. Now, Dawn may sort of raised briefly earlier a point about how there's actually different rules, and going through this is a bit of a headache, and I think you need to have a sit down and take an hour on yourself to sort of work out how these two rules interact. The second rule is to do with the RTC period. So what HMRC have introduced is that for RTC, it stops time limits expiring between 6th of April 2017 and 4th of April 2021. So they expired 5th of April 2021 instead. So this is a separate rule that ties in and is, I guess it's related to these extended offshore assessment time limits. I'm not going to try and explain how they interact right here right now.
I mean, I think the thing is, if you have this applied in practice, you'd have to look at each case and each year and work out which time limit applied. There's no shortcut, I'm afraid.
Okay. Is there any shortcut if the taxpayers died? How far can they go back?
Oh yes, so actually, I mean, it's awful to say, but death helps with time limits.
Handy in a tax investigation.
Exactly, it's always useful. Yes, so the standard rules for deceased taxpayers do apply. So, and that would override the offshore assessment time limits, and of course they can't assess penalties on deceased taxpayers either. So yeah.
Is the 12 years extended time limit being reviewed by the government, as far as you're aware?
It already has been, so it was subject. It kind of got lost in all the loan charge noise, but it was reviewed as part of the House of Lords review. And actually, our text in the grey box on Jack's slide here is what changed as part of the review. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so as far as your assessment time limits are concerned, when does that start?
It's already enforced now. So yeah. Yeah.
I guess the question is it the date the assessment is raised going back 12 years, or the date they make the discovery into?
It's the date of the assessment. Yeah.
Okay. Will offshore shareholders be investigated?
Could be, yes. So I mean,
why not?
No, exactly. Yeah.
It's a quick one last point on this. The time limits is the defence, which Dawn highlighted as the grey box on the right-hand side of the screen. So if HMRC receive information and you can expect them reasonably to become aware of the loss of tax within the normal time limits, so 4 or 6 years, and don't do anything about it, then the normal time limits will still apply. The problem here is the word reasonably, and what that means. I mean, there's been quite a lot of case law recently on discovery, and I think cases have landed both sides of the fences for HMRC and for the taxpayer. So it's a bit of a minefield, but I think that's something we can discuss in future.
Yeah, and how do you know what information HMRC has got in practice? I mean, you're going to have to ask HMRC to show you their files, which is going to be quite strange, or they're going to get a lot of freedom of information, subject to access requests.
Which they'll refuse to.
Which, they'll then,
to.
Exactly. So, I think in practice, this will be quite difficult actually to use. Although this was meant to be a safeguard from the government review, I'm not sure how useful it's actually going to be, which is a bit disappointing.
We've also got, because this area is quite complex, we've put a further reading link at the bottom of the screen, and this gives a bit more detail of the assessment time limits and also the interaction with the RTC stops. So I think that will be sent out with the slides. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, on that point about the when they're aware of the information, we've seen HMRC just refusing to tell you.
Oh, really?
They've just said, no, we're not aware when we were told.
Very unhelpful.
Because they don't want, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, they don't want to block their own powers. Okay, interesting.
Okay. So on to the failure to correct penalties. So let's start with looking at the requirement to correct period. The requirement to correct period, RTC period, started 6th of April 2017 and it ended 30th September 2018. Now, what HMRC wanted taxpayers to do in this period was to come forward and disclose any offshore, any liabilities to UK tax that relate to offshore matters. Now, if the taxpayer did it in this period, they would not face the failure to correct penalties, and you can see why by looking at the numbers on the screen. If you make a prompted disclosure, the maximum penalty is 200% and minimum penalty is 150%. Unprompted, again, maximum 200%, minimum 100%. an interesting sort of thing about this is that in the legislation, the minimum penalty, 100%, and the maximum, 200%, is set out. But that 150% for minimum for prompted, is was set by HMRC. It's not in legislation. So we haven't seen many of these yet. So it might be that an argument could be made that the 150% could be lowered even more. We'll go into the penalty mitigation in a second, but it remains to be seen if that can be budged. For these penalties, the main thing, the first question you need to ask yourself is there a reasonable excuse? If there's not, it doesn't matter, then you'll be hit with penalties. That's because reasonable excuse is one of the defences against penalties. Dawn will be looking at that later. But if it's careless or deliberate, you're hit with one of these penalties. So, as well as these huge penalties, HMRC have also put in 3 other deterrents. So there's offshore asset move penalties, asset-based penalties, and they also can publish the details of deliberate defaulters. So the offshore asset move penalties is when, in the RTC period, an individual moved an asset from a specified country, which effectively is a country that has signed up to CRS, to a non-specified country, which is someone who hasn't signed up to CRS. And I guess that's they thinking is the aim of trying to avoid the CRS or getting the data passed on to the UK tax authorities. So the penalty there, it can be up to 50% of the penalty levied under the FTC. So say you've got £1 million worth of tax, you get unprompted disclosure and you get full mitigation, 100% penalty. So it's £1 million penalty. And then you get 50% on top of that. So you get £1 million tax, £1 million penalty, and another 500 grand assets move penalties. That's £2.5 million potential.
And I think the concern is that will people have this money to pay the penalties? I mean, regardless of what you think about the debate about whether they're right or wrong, is and we'll come on to talk about voluntary disclosures, is if the revenue want voluntary disclosures where they're asking for, if you like, more than 100%, more than all the money there, is this just going to lead to more bankruptcies?
What is the incentive to come forward?
And where is
take your chances?
Well, exactly. Yeah, and that is the concern generally. It's that balance of the revenue have been successful at raising money today, in my view, through voluntary disclosure campaigns. Failure to correct possibly risks that approach, and is it going to work? So yeah, and also as Jack's put on the slide, that the challenge is gathering the evidence against this stuff. In reality, the revenue will charge them, and then you'll have to appeal them, and that's usually what happens in practice, isn't it? So yeah.
Yeah, so there is a stand. You can stand appeal rights for these penalties, but they can't be suspended though. So it's different to normal penalties. So again, the other thing we're talking about is asset-based penalties. So if the tax due under FTC is over £25,000, which you can imagine in most cases it probably will be, an HMRC can charge an asset-based penalty, which is up to 10% of the value of the relevant asset. So if you've got a bank account that's has income and gains in it, then it'd be 10% of the value of the bank account.
Yeah, yeah. And again, you know, the revenue suggests that they do have evidence that people are moving assets. I mean, you wonder whether these things are just thought of in theory, but anecdotally they are saying that they do have evidence that people have moved.
Surely you're not suggesting HMRC make policy on hoof.
Of course not. Of course not. But it does seem, you know, it's like how do they know this stuff? But there are suggestions that people have moved assets to avoid CRS reporting. I mean, you look at the countries that are left and you think, well, tax is the least of your worries, basically, whether you'll get your 100% of your money back, let alone pay.
And I think it's not just actually moving the asset, it's hiding who owns it. So if you give the asset to another person, but you still the beneficial owner, then HMRC will treat that as you moving the asset effectively.
Yeah. Which of course is a lot of the interest in overseas companies and overseas trustees as well. So yeah.
And another thing that HMRC put into place is they will publish the details of deliberate defaulters. Again, this only happened if the tax due is over £25,000. Now, one of the ways to get out of this is if the taxpayer gets 100% mitigation of the penalty. So you have to do everything right. We'll look at in a minute. We'll look now what you need to do to mitigate penalties. So these are pretty much similar to how penalties are mitigated in normal circumstances. So there's telling, helping, giving. So telling is telling HMRC what's gone wrong, the extent of it, and everything you know about it. Any new information comes along, tell them about it. Helping is going through bank statements, providing explanations, even calculating the tax due, calculating amount of income within a bank account, attending meetings, be it just HMRC and the advisor or with the taxpayer, and then giving access to documents and bank statements, some correspondence if it's relevant and it's requested by HMRC. Now, the one new thing here that HMRC have put in is under the telling manner. Now, HMRC has said you can get further mitigation for telling if you provide information about anyone who's helped you facilitate offshore evasion / non-compliance. So this is quite a difficult one because it puts people in a funny position because no one really wants to tell people except people that's helped them out. It may be that it's a long-standing advisor who put the instruction into place, and HMRC effectively want you to grasp them in effectively.
Yeah. And I think, it's kind of the price of martyrdom. Do you pay a higher penalty or do you give them all the information about other people to mitigate it? And it puts people in quite an uncomfortable position.
So are we saying there that if you make a voluntary disclosure, it's unprompted, they want 100% penalty, then you can get 100% mitigated?
Yeah, so if you follow, if it's a really good disclosure.
That's not something HMRC are doing at the moment, I can tell you that.
They're saying 100% minimum.
100%
minimum. Yeah. I mean, let's see, we have cases where FTC should apply, but we haven't actually seen them penalties charged. So I think this is going to be a lot of the area of debate is testing the legislation.
I can think of one that I saw it yesterday. There's a guy who owned a property in New Zealand, I think it was. There's no capital gains tax there, so he made the disclosure and they've hit him and said, no, it's minimum 100%.
Yeah.
There's no mention of reasonable excuse. There's no mention of none of this penalty mitigation. They're saying it's straight on 100%.
Yeah.
So are we saying we should be going back in those cases and saying actually you've got to give penalty mitigation?
Well, it depends where they start, doesn't it? So if it's unprompted, then it is a minimum 100%. If they start at the 200%, which we've seen cases, they're starting at 200%, then you should ask for mitigation. But yeah, they should consider reasonable excuse as well, because, and this is always the problem, is it's starting at, if you like, the worst position for the taxpayer.
But I think certainly for the cases we're coming across in recent days almost, are we saying that penalty mitigation should apply, even if it's a voluntary disclosure, 100% penalty? They should be going back and saying, no, we've told you, we've helped you, we've given access.
Well, the legislation is minimum 100% penalty on a voluntary. It is. Yeah, it
is.
Is.
So this penalty mitigation isn't going to apply to
no, it's going to be, well, sometimes they start higher, so you just need to see what their starting point is. So sometimes they're saying 200% even on a voluntary. So that's where we need to start. I mean, a good question here, sorry, just going back to CRS data, is if someone's non-dom, so they're new to the country, so maybe they don't even need to pay the remittance basis charge, but they are resident here, are the bank details still being transferred, even if they're not bringing any money to the UK? I mean, the answer is yes. So the CRS data doesn't recognise non-domiciled, and again, I think that has caused concern amongst people who have non-domiciled clients.
And I know the accountant involved there who's actually listening in. Thanks, Adam, for your case study. He's gone back and they're waiting to hear about the appeal. We did advise to appeal back on the basis of reasonable care was taken.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna come on to, which is a good segue into what is a reasonable excuse actually, because I think where there's no penalty mitigation, so they're saying 100% minimum or even 200% minimum because it's it's an inquiry rather than a voluntary, then you need to look through this very carefully. So do you have a reasonable excuse? And as you said, Kevin, I don't think the revenue will volunteer this in practice. I think you're going to have to set the ball rolling yourself. Clearly this is a subjective test. It's going to depend on the facts of the case. So the excuse is reasonable, so it's that subjective word again. And actually this is extremely important, the point about no unreasonable delay once you realise there's a problem. And I am seeing the revenue wanting to check that more and more in practice. So if it's your client, when did you as the advisor become aware of it? When you told your client there was a problem, how quickly did they instruct you to write to the revenue? If there's months and months, I mean, we had one where unfortunately someone had some family circumstances that meant there was I think almost a year delay in us actually sending in the disclosure. No one's fault, but we had to explain why that wasn't unreasonable. And so we got into a whole debate about that. So I mean, just do it quickly is the advice. If you find out something's wrong, do it quickly, because then you can help your penalty mitigation.
Did they issue any guidelines on what they thought was a reasonable time? I vaguely remember they issued something that said you must notify within a certain date.
I haven't seen anything in the compliance handbook. Okay. I haven't seen anything, but I think in case law there's been a few examples of where within 3 to 6 months, I seem to think.
I think the thing is, as you say, just get it in there as soon as you find out.
Just get it in there. And often, you know, practice, send a short, if it's complicated, the calculations, and you need a lot of time, send them an initial letter and then follow up with all the so you've got your you've got your voluntary in from day one, and then you can start to work out all the calculations. You know, if that's going to take you several months, or getting information from a bank overseas can take time, can't it, in our experience? So you know, it can take a lot of months, several months. So you don't. But for the reasonable excuse, you don't want to sit around. So we have got a little bit of guidance, the kind of bottom of this slide, on what a reasonable excuse could be. So again, if you actually don't have the money and it's outside your control, I haven't actually seen that in practice. Reliance on another person, where you did take reasonable care. I mean, this is probably the key. So maybe you got advice. We've seen people who've had advice that they didn't need to report something, and actually it turns out they did. So, you know, maybe your previous accountant just got it wrong. Or you had, again, linked to that, reliance on advice, which is not disqualified. And this whole concept comes up from HMRC getting annoyed about avoidance, basically. So I mean, if we flip on to the next slide.
So just going back to the reasonable excuse.
There's
no mention there. I think we've seen a normal penalty arguments about the special circumstances of the individual. So are they still supposed to take that into account as well?
No.
So if, for example, you've got someone who's 90 years old with Alzheimer's, are they going to accept that as a reasonable excuse, or say it doesn't matter because they'll have forgotten it in the morning?
Well, yeah, I mean, it very kind of unfortunately, the failure to correct guidance says that they can't be reduced due to special circumstances.
Right, okay, so specifically excluded.
It's specifically
so such
excluded.
things as Joe raises, what if a client genuinely didn't know about RTC?
Well, that's a very good question, because is ignorance ever a reasonable excuse? And now this has been the subject of a lot of case law in the tribunal, and the case law is split. So in practice, I would run that argument if you think genuinely, particularly your older person who maybe is not financially qualified, you know, then they're not an accountant themselves.
Well, that's right. They're 80 years old then.
And they were genuinely completely oblivious to the rules. Then ignorance can be an excuse in some circumstances. So yeah, I think, and they should. I mean, in practice, they should take into account the health and age and experience of the taxpayer. So I think, you know, as advisors, we should push that. That's a good point.
Israel does make the comment, as an ex-HMRC employee, he never once saw 100% penalty mitigation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that just flags the point, which is it's going to get harder and harder to get, in my view, to get a mitigated penalty. It is. And there does, you know, our reason for saying obsession with offshore is there does seem to be a bit of anti-offshore in the revenue. So if something offshore, they want to charge you a penalty on it. Failure to correct obviously only applies to the offshore. So you're in more hot water right from the start. So yeah. So linked to the do you have a reasonable excuse, and this could help you actually in practice, is, well, actually I had some advice on what I did or didn't do, and that advice is qualified advice, so it's not disqualified. And this is a new concept, is advice qualified or disqualified? And I mean, just to give you a tiny bit of background to this, I think in practice the revenue have said they just got annoyed with people who brought off the shelf in their view, avoidance arrangements, and it had a kind of bog standard tax counsel or accountant's opinion that said, yes, this is fine and it works, and it wasn't specific to the taxpayer. So in practice, what they want people to do is actually get advice just for them.
Right.
So if you are going to do anything, it's connected to offshore. I think a kind of tip coming out of all the failure to correct stuff is, well, get advice, make sure it is bespoke for you, and then you can rely on it.
Yeah.
So if something does go wrong in the future, ideally you would have a defence that you had qualified advice. I mean, in practice, all of this needs to be tested, and I think that the disappointing thing now is that we have so many highly subjective tests. So what is qualified and disqualified advice is something for the main purpose of generating a tax advantage. Well, that's quite subjective. And it is the advice given to the taxpayer by an interested person. So who is an interested person? Again, that's a subjective definition. I mean, usually it's a person who participated in the avoidance arrangement, or they were paid basically for helping the taxpayer to do the arrangement. So, I mean, that could be something like a provider of an overseas company, a trustee. It could be all sorts of interested persons, but all of this is fraught with definitions that haven't yet been tested. Yes. We've had reasonableness for a while, haven't we? But we haven't had things like qualified and disqualified. Interested persons is a new test. Whether or not something is just established practice. So, I mean, you could argue, well, if you're non-domicile and you set up an offshore trust, that's just established practice, yes. You know. Yeah. Or you're a foreign national who's come to live in the UK for, say, on secondment with work or whatever. You know, the fact that you have an overseas bank account, well, that's just established practice. That's nothing to do with tax.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all these things are, I think, arguable. In practice, we will have to see how far the revenue try and charge the penalties. Yeah, will be interesting, very interesting. So, conscious, just to finish off the slides, are voluntary disclosures still worth doing? Well, that's an easy answer, yes. I mean, I think the problem is that the cost just got a lot higher if you have anything offshore, and the risk of criminal, now they have the CRS data or something like a Code of Practice 9, so something particularly nasty, is increased. You know, that's the brave new world we live in. Jack mentioned earlier that don't just think about the worldwide disclosure facility. I mean, you kind of already covered off this point. There are other options, including if you're a wealthy customer going to your CCM. And they've actually been quite helpful in accepting voluntary disclosures in practice. So that's good. And yeah, you know, never, as I've already said, never underestimate the amount of data that the revenue hold about people. and also how they'll use that, particularly cross-referencing it with other data that they hold. We've seen the classic, someone buying an expensive car and they checked it with a DVLA, checked their means against their tax return, and now popped an inquiry. So yeah.
Okay, so you've got a couple of questions. Does an individual have rights under data protection rules to see what data is held on them?
Well, yes, I mean, you can go down the legal route. So a subject access data request. I mean, there are resistance to that.
The resistance, they say, is it's not in the public interest to let you see the sources that we have.
Yeah.
Which is
so there are,
argued.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you risk some pushback, but you can ask. Yeah.
If a property is inherited but there's no income or gains, does it need to be declared?
No, I mean, if it doesn't trigger anything,
there's got to be a tax liability.
Yeah, there's got to be a tax liability. I mean, if you receive something as an inheritance or a gift, then there's no immediate tax issue.
Ramsey, displaying his sense of humour in the tax world, is there any protection under human rights? Well, you'd like to think so.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you speak to any lawyer, they would love to have that argument, I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, certainly in penalties, they're supposed to give the human rights leaflet, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
As soon as there's a sniff of a penalty.
And to hold them to account on that,
Yes.
check they've got evidence that they have sent out that warning letter. Yeah.
If money's not remitted to the UK for interest, does it need to be declared? One dom-doms.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it depends if you're taxable on a worldwide basis. So if you're non-dom, then no. If you are domiciled or deemed domiciled, then yes. Yeah.
Okay. Lastly, the information from the overseas exchanges, how often is that given to HMRC?
We understand it's annually at the moment, so every year. Whether that increases and they start it on a quarterly
How
or
many billion pieces of information did you say they've got?
22 billion.
22 billion. That's just from overseas.
Yeah.
So a few stamps going to be spent there then.
Exactly. So I think I think we've covered everything. We've covered reasonable excuse, failure to correct. I think the key message from us is if you spot something, disclose it, just don't delay. And yes, if you have any valid arguments to reduce the penalties, then run them.
Yeah. As you said, the key is to test it in this early stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so on screen there we have some contact details. You want to say something about your support line?
Yes, so we do have a tax support line for professionals. So, I mean, particularly in our area, obviously, it is quite specialised. People do use that service, so the numbers are there. It's also on bdo.co.uk. So do have a look if it's of interest.
And obviously, those of you with the PFP membership can use our helpline as well. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I would thank Dawn and Jack for coming along and give us the benefit of their experience and knowledge today. I would also remind you, those of you who haven't registered for our tax investigations conference, which is coming up on Friday the 11th of October, usually a very good and interesting day. If anybody would like to join that, please contact us. I see on screen we're offering a 20% discount, which I was unaware of when we started, but that's great. If anybody wants to come along, please feel free. It'd be great to see you. We've got a number of really great speakers there, and I know Dawn has presented there in the past.
Yeah, it's always a good day. You always learn some new things and get some tips. So yeah, it's good.
So we will be having another webinar, one a month now for the rest of the year. So this is one of our series of webinars for our member firms and selected guests. We will be sending out the slides and possibly a recording, depending upon the quality of it. Meanwhile, thank you again, Jack and Dawn.
Thanks.
And thank you all for listening, and we hope to speak to you soon.